Good afternoon. Thank you for taking time to listen to me today. I'm going to present you with some short extracts from examples of science communications of various forms that I would like you to interrogate. In doing so, I will offer some guide questions, and I very much look forward to your views at the end of the talk. However, I'm going to start by setting out some background that offers a position from which to interrogate my examples. I want to begin by suggesting how I will use the term science communicator in an inclusive sense. So amongst science communicators are teachers, whether generalist teachers of lower ages asked to teach some science, specialist science teachers and lecturers from within more specialist science disciplines. But also scientists writing for other scientists in research papers, monographs and review articles. Scientists, sometimes the same ones of course, writing or talking to a more general audience through talks, books, interviews, videos or whatever. Journalists who report on science. Authors of popular science books, which may overlap with previous categories in that these authors may be scientists themselves or science journalists, but sometimes in a somewhat discrete group of science writers who specialise in trade books. As not everybody works with written texts, I perhaps need to also include the writers and producers of scientific documentaries and the like, in case some of these people are not already found in my previous categories. I should also perhaps include a group of people who are academics and who write about science, but are not natural scientists themselves. These may be historians, philosophers, sociologists and the like. Their focus may not be the science per se. So, for example, the historian of science is looking to describe and explain history, not science, and may be more interested in a now defunct perspective or theory than current canonical understanding, but nonetheless may feel at some points a need to offer a scientific account as background for their argument. Perhaps I should also include people like myself in this category, science educators, as sometimes in writing about the teaching of science it's appropriate to set out the science as background for making pedagogic points. I am going to make what I think is a reasonable claim, which is that when such science communicators set about communicating science, an aim is, at least sometimes, to lead their audience to understand that science. That is one purpose of the science lesson or lecture, of the scientific paper or monograph, of the news report or science documentary, of the popular science book or the outreach talk given by a scientific researcher, is to facilitate members of an audience in coming to a new understanding of some science. In this sense, all scientific communication may be considered to have a pedagogic intent. However, I would also like to draw a key distinction between two meanings or senses of understanding. I'm certainly not suggesting that these are mutually exclusive, just that they can be considered as somewhat independent of each other. I will refer to these two somewhat distinct foci as objective and subjective understanding. Subjective understanding is an internal thing. You read or hear something, you may feel it clearly makes sense and you fully understand it, or perhaps not. Perhaps it was completely, as the idiom goes, over your head, and you haven't the vaguest idea what was meant. That is rare perhaps, but there are certainly shades of confidence one may feel in one's understanding. Now, subjective understanding is perhaps more about feeling than thinking, or at least it seems to be largely informed by implicit knowledge. One comes out of a lecture or finishes reading a paper, and one has a feeling about the extent to which one has understood. I think subjective understanding is, initially at least, more an affective evaluation than a conceptual one. By contrast, objective understanding is not about how well you feel you understand, but the extent to which you can demonstrate understanding to others against some community-agreed criteria. Teachers know all about this. Efforts are made to set up assessment activities which give a valid and reliable measure of whether the learners understand food webs, capacitors in parallel, or electrolytic cells. I should point out often the key referent here is not current canonical scientific knowledge, but some curriculum model located at some turn of the spiral curriculum, which likely simplifies and sometimes oversimplifies the science. Anyway, I think to the questionable extent that it's meaningful to apply quantitative terms to a feeling like subjective understanding, there is likely to be a positive correlation between measures of these two forms of understanding. People are more likely to feel they understand something when objectively they do. People are more likely to be able to demonstrate objective understanding of those things they feel make sense to them. But those of you who are practicing teachers are likely to agree when I suggest that even if such a correlation is statistically significant, it would not approach unity. We have all surely experienced learners who can regularly get high marks on questions about some bit of science that they persist in claiming makes little sense to them. That can be very frustrating, as we cannot direct all such learners to scientific fields like quantum mechanics. Similarly, we have all had those happy, smiling students nod to confirm they fully understood something that we later find they have not understood it in anything like the way intended. Perhaps we could send that group off to become postmodernist social scientists, but that would be a loss for the natural sciences. So here comes the crux of my talk, which is in effect a question. Should science communication be about promoting subjective or objective understanding? Now, I argued in teaching and in scientific papers both are really important. We want our students to be able to get the right answers in assessment and feel confident about their knowledge. The same surely applies with regard to authors and their colleagues when talking about research reports and reviews within a scientific community. But what about the brief news report item, the science documentary, the popular science book, the outreach talk intended to engage a general audience and the like? Should these be intended to bring about a subjective and objective understanding? Or is subjective understanding sometimes enough? If a journalist has a 30-second spot to explain some breakthrough in cancer research or new discovery in deep space, is it enough to give the audience members a feeling that they've got the gist of the scientific achievement? If someone reads a popular book about the immune system or black holes or volcanoes, should they only expect to feel they've learnt something, or should they have a reasonable expectation of actually acquiring some creditable knowledge? Since retirement has given me more time for reading for interest, I've come to be rather obsessed with such questions because of the large number of metaphors and analogies and the like I've noticed. Some seem ingenious and apt, but some of these I felt would only work for someone who already understood the scientific point being made. And some, I felt, didn't really explain very much, but just offered a familiar image or comparison which might act at best as a kind of placeholder for genuine understanding. For example, a phrase like "the nucleus is the brain of the cell" could be a very productive one if it was the starting point for an inquiry into in what sense or senses the nucleus of a cell might be said to be like or unlike a person's brain in their body. But by itself, it's just a motto, a slogan, that may give the impression that I understand what the cell nucleus does. It's the cell's brain. Some comparisons that are used to introduce people to technical ideas are more obvious than others. I've posted this challenge, where I've separately listed 10 scientific concepts and the comparisons used to help explain them. Of course, in the original source there was useful context, but when isolated like this, I'm not sure it's obvious which scientific idea matches which comparison. Indeed, I'm not sure I can now explain some of these links. I am now almost ready to ask you to look at some examples. First, however, I'm just going to reiterate some very basic ideas about learning and understanding that I suspect are widely familiar in our community. However, teachers should be wary of making such assumptions, so just in case. Human learning is incremental, interpretive and iterative. It's incremental because a person's working memory has a very limited capacity to handle new information. So, complex material needs to be deconstructed into modest learning quanta, which are presented at a pace human cognition can cope with. Learning is interpretive because in order to make sense of new information, we rely on the resources we already have available. This is why comparisons with what is already familiar are so useful. They help make the unfamiliar familiar. Because learning is incremental and interpretive, it tends to be iterative. We tend to more readily accept things that fit with our existing way of thinking and build up new understandings accordingly. Back here in the real world, teaching often goes wrong because teaching is not made sense of in the way the teacher hoped. Teachers can at least monitor how they are understood using formative assessment techniques and so adjust their presentations. That facility is not available to the science communicator writing a text or being interviewed on the radio or giving a one-off public talk. So, to some examples. I want to start by considering similes, where the science communicator sets out to make the unfamiliar familiar by pointing out that in some sense the unfamiliar target is a bit like something already familiar. Some of the most basic and unproblematic examples I've found are where naturalists are describing some species, so perhaps a part of a plant, by suggesting it's shaped like some familiar everyday item. The intention is to describe, and many of these examples seem quite unproblematic. Of course, even here, as with this comparison, we're reliant on the audience having the right interpretive resources, and some comparisons may go out of date and may be less clear to a contemporary reader. I think this is an interesting example because it shows us that Darwin was confident his correspondents would be familiar with the story of poor Lot's wife, who tends to only be known as a +1. As he was writing to a university professor who had to be an ordained Church of England priest to qualify for his teaching post, this seems a fair assumption. Henslow shared Darwin's letter with members of the scientific society, who would all also be assumed to be familiar with this story. I'm not sure how true this will be today. However, I would also point out that neither Darwin or Henslow, nor indeed anybody else alive at that time, had ever seen Lot's wife, either before or after she became collateral damage in what was supposed to be God's imprecisely targeted wrath. I guess in the days before television, personal computers and mobile phones, people had to create their own entertainment by imagining scenes of death and destruction they read about for themselves. That's a slightly cynical point, but I do suspect that for Darwin and Henslow and their discourse community, a reference to Lot's wife would likely bring a very specific and vivid image to mind. Otherwise, the simile has no value. I'm using literary terms like simile and metaphor. There is a distinction there that I think is important. A simile is marked as a comparison, so it may suggest that X is like Y, or X is Y-like, or X does something in the way Y does. Or it may report that X is said to be a Y, but then the Y is put in scare quotes. There is a qualification such as a so to speak, an if you like, or an in a sense to mark the simile. Here are some examples which you may or may not interpret as the science communicator intended. I am not going to comment much on these examples, as I'd like to give you all a chance to reflect on them. Here are a selection of other examples, or at least my headline versions of them. I use the label metaphor when we're told an X is a Y, without any indication this is meant figuratively, not literally. This potentially adds an extra burden for the audience, as they have to first spot that a comparison is being made before they can interpret the meaning. Here are some examples which you may or may not interpret as the science communicator intended. Sometimes one comes across extended metaphors which start to approach formal analogies. Here are some examples which you may or may not interpret as the science communicator intended. And from the same source, this is an example of the metaphorical density of figurative language in some popular science writing, and it's not a complete outlier. This is perhaps an extreme example, as this book sets out to present disease and immunity in terms of an extended military analogy. Of course, this is by no means unique to this account, but I doubt many other uses of the analogy have involved such an intensive bombardment of a reader. In many ways this is a useful analogy, but whereas a good teacher would examine both its strengths and limitations, knowing that areas of difference are also useful teaching points, the popular science author may not. One common feature shown here is how a comparison introduced initially as a simile is then treated as a metaphor, presumably for economy of expression. Idioms seem to me to be metaphors that have become conventionalised. Presumably, at some point, someone who first used an idiom meant it as a metaphor and expected its meaning to be clear to an audience. Over time, the phrase has come to stand for a whole class of situations with something in common. Now, the key distinction between a new metaphor and an idiom is that a naive person has at least a decent chance of making sense of most metaphors, as the comparisons have been chosen to be meaningful to that audience. However, the particular metaphorical meaning of idioms have to be familiar already to make sense, and I assume may be especially challenging to second language learners. Now, there is a clear simile here about the rocket, and I think the extended metaphor about the cannonball and shotgun will be clear to most people. I think most people could work these comparisons out. But what about a Hail Mary approach? Hail Mary is a traditional Catholic prayer. What has that got to do with asteroids? Of course, Hail Mary approach is nothing to do with offering a prayer, but is said to mean a last-ditch effort. But then, isn't last ditch also an idiom? Someone unfamiliar with English idioms might wonder what ditches have to do with anything. So that's as clear as ditch water then. And science communication is populated, so to speak, by a great variety of metaphors. I consider an analogy to be a comparison between two conceptual structures where an explicit mapping is offered. Here are some examples of what I mean by this. I'm not going to talk about analogy in any depth today, as a well-framed analogy offers a clear mapping between the positive features that are analogous across the two systems. So although analogies may be more or less useful to an audience, and still require the analogue to already be familiar, the reader or listener is not left to work out the relevance of the comparison for herself. I would just take the opportunity to point out that when used in teaching, it is important to highlight the negative as well as the positive features of analogies, just as it's important to introduce new concepts through non-examples as well as examples. We may think it's obvious that all electrons are identical, and this need not be pointed out. But if the old atom as a tiny solar system analogy is met, why should the learner realise that, unless it's pointed out? If that seems an extreme example. I do not expect you to take in the details of this example, but just wanted to show that structural analogies between conceptual systems can get quite complex. This was a headline in a science magazine. But the comparison was actually suggested in the primary scientific literature. Perhaps everyone should know the story of the accidental discovery of the Americas, a discovery that came as no surprise to the people already living there, of course. But I wonder about the additional cognitive load for a reader who lacked this point of reference. Perhaps today we would no longer be surprised if our overseas communications were translated en route. Again, there are many more examples out there. A particular class of metaphors are those which present non-human entities as having the feelings, perceptions, motivations, reflections, intentions and actions of people. This issue of the scientific validity of engaging figurative phrases was one I was already concerned about in my doctoral studies. I wrote a paper with my supervisor, Mike Watts, about the anthropomorphic language used by my students in talking about atoms and bonds and electrons and the like, as in these examples. I came to the conclusion that such anthropomorphism could be a useful temporary crutch, if you excuse my metaphor, in coming to think about the unfamiliar micro-world, so critical in making sense of chemistry, making that unfamiliar world seem familiar enough to not seem scary and too abstract, and so allowing the potential for the development of more canonical arguments and explanations. But too often, these intended temporary pseudo-explanations become permanently adopted by learners as if the explanations they need to learn and apply. This is from a fascinating account written by a neurodiverse biochemist who argues that she understands human relationships in terms of chemical interactions. My own reading of what is going on is rather different, but she is clearly in the privileged position to comment. This is from the great Richard Feynman, but I do not find this explains very much at all. The big issue here is not that a person has to work hard to make sense of such passages, but rather that they are easily made sense of, as long as one accepts that inanimate objects such as molecules and electrons and so forth have feelings and perceptions and thoughts and desires and intentions and act deliberately. It's the most natural thing in the world to understand clouds and stars and crystals and microbes through the way we experience the world. The problem surely is that this is not the scientific account, and the scientific account may sometimes be obscured rather than revealed through such usage. Again, this type of thing is common in science communication. My intention today is more to pose questions rather than suggest answers, so I want to finish with some points for discussion.